On February 12, 1947, Pike County Sheriff's Office received a telegram requesting medical assistance at a remote Kentucky homestead. The archived message mentioned childbirth complications. What it didn't mention was that this single birth would lead investigators to 26 unmarked graves hidden in the Appalachian Mountains. Before we dive into the story, quick question. What's the creepiest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. Vera Hutchins, a trained nurse from Pikeville with 7 years of experience assisting in difficult births, made the journey on horseback through snow-covered mountain passes. The route to the Grayson homestead took nearly 4 hours, winding through valleys where winter fog clung to hemlock branches and ice glazed the narrow trails. She arrived just before dusk, when the February light was already failing and the temperature had dropped below freezing. The homestead itself sat in a hollow, surrounded by steep ridges, accessible only by a single-headed put that even in good weather would challenge most vehicles. 3 structures occupied the clearing: a weathered 2-story house with a sagging porch, a barn with broken boards showing through gaps in the siding, and a smaller outbuilding that might have served as a smokehouse or root cellar. No other dwelling stood within sight, and the nearest neighbor lived more than 2 miles distant over rough terrain. Inside, Vera found the expectant mother, Sarah Grayson, in advanced labor and clearly exhausted from hours of contractions. The local midwife, an elderly woman named Mrs. Keller, who had attended births in these mountains for 40 years, looked visibly relieved at Vera's arrival. But as Vera began her examination and prepared her instruments, she noticed details that troubled her professional instincts. The windows throughout the house had been boarded from the inside, not outside, as would be typical for winter insulation. Dark stains marked the wooden floorboards in several rooms, stains that looked organic and old, worked deep into the grain despite obvious attempts at scrubbing. The house smelled wrong, not just of wood smoke and cooking, but of something earthier and more disturbing that Vera couldn't quite identify. Sarah's husband, Thomas Grayson, a lean man in his 30s with calloused hands and watchful eyes, hovered near the bedroom door, but refused to enter or answer direct questions about his wife's medical history. When Vera asked about previous pregnancies or complications, he simply stated that Sarah had always been healthy and walked away. His manner wasn't hostile exactly, but evasive in a way that suggested something more than typical mountain reticence. The birth proceeded through the night with considerable difficulty. Sarah was weak, possibly malnourished, and Vera had to use every technique she'd learned to safely deliver a healthy baby girl just after dawn. As Mrs. Keller cleaned the infant and Vera attended to the mother, Sarah grabbed Vera's wrist with surprising strength. Her whispered words were barely audible. "Count the graves behind the barn." Vera tried to question her further, but Sarah had already lapsed into exhausted sleep. Mrs. Keller, packing her bag to leave now that the crisis had passed, claimed not to have heard anything. Thomas reappeared to see his daughter, showed no particular emotion, and asked when Vera would be departing. In the pale morning light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows, Vera Hutchins made a decision that would change everything. She told Thomas she needed to rest before the long journey back to Pikeville, and she intended to find out what lay behind that barn. Vera waited until mid-morning, claiming fatigue from the overnight delivery. Thomas had disappeared into the barn, and Mrs. Keller had already begun her journey back down the mountain. When Vera finally stepped outside, The February air cut through her coat, and fresh snow had begun to fall, obscuring her footprints as she walked. Behind the barn, partially hidden by overgrown brambles and a stand of bare hickory trees, she found them. 26 river stones arranged in rough rows, each marking a slight depression in the frozen earth. No names, no dates, just smooth gray rocks that someone had carefully positioned. The graves, if that's what they were, varied in length. Some suggested children, others adults. The vegetation patterns told her these weren't recent. Years, possibly decades of growth, surrounded the oldest markers. She returned to the house shaken, but maintaining her composure. Thomas was waiting on the porch, his expression unreadable. Vera thanked him for his hospitality and rode back to Pikeville through the mounting snowstorm, her mind racing with what she'd witnessed. But in 1947 rural Kentucky, a nurse's suspicions about river stones behind a barn carried little weight. She needed someone who could act on what she'd found. Deputy Luther Bingham had served Pike County for 15 years, long enough to know every hollow and homestead in his territory. When Vera appeared at his office 3 days after returning from the Grayson property, he listened with the patience of a man who'd heard many strange stories from the mountains. But something in her detailed account, the specific number of stones, and her description of Sarah's whispered warning, caught his attention. Luther pulled the county records, such as they were. The filing system consisted of ledgers maintained by whoever happened to be working the office, with gaps and inconsistencies common. What he found regarding the Grayson family struck him as unusual. The homestead had been in the family since 1883, passed down through generations, who rarely appeared in any official capacity beyond property tax payments and occasional legal filings. More troubling were the notations scattered across 2 decades. In 1928, a cousin named Edmund Grayson was listed as relocated to family property for health reasons. No departure record existed. In 1932, 2 siblings from a related family, the Morelands, were noted as visiting extended family, with no subsequent documentation. 1937 brought another entry, temporary resident for harvest work, with a name that had been poorly recorded and no follow-up information. 8 people over 20 years, all connected somehow to the Grayson homestead, all with vague explanations for their presence and complete silence about their departure. In isolation, each entry seemed unremarkable. Mountain families helped each other through difficult seasons, took in relatives during hard times, hired wandering laborers when needed. But together, viewed through the lens of Vera's discovery, the pattern suggested something far more disturbing. Luther closed the ledger and looked at the nurse sitting across from his desk. The law in 1947 Kentucky operated under significant limitations, especially in remote areas where isolation bred independence and suspicion of outside authority. He couldn't simply ride up to the Grayson property and demand answers based on river stones and vague record-keeping. He needed more, something concrete that would justify official intervention. He began making discreet inquiries, starting with families whose names appeared in those old ledgers. Most lived in neighboring counties now, scattered across eastern Kentucky and into West Virginia. The conversations would take weeks, maybe months, but Luther Bingham had learned patience in these mountains, and Vera Hutchins' account had planted a seed of dread that he couldn't ignore. 26 stones behind a barn, and 8 names in incomplete records. The mathematics alone demanded answers. Luther's first interview took him to Harlan County, where he found Margaret Stillwell living in a small house near the coal mines. She was 61 years old, her hands gnarled from decades of washing clothes and tending gardens. When Luther mentioned the Grayson family, her face tightened. Her sister Ruth had gone to help at the homestead during the harsh winter of 1932. The Graysons needed assistance caring for Thomas's ailing grandfather, and Ruth, unmarried and known for her nursing skills, had volunteered. She was 34 years old, healthy and strong. The family received one letter 6 weeks after her arrival, brief and oddly formal, stating she'd decided to move to Cincinnati for factory work. Ruth had never mentioned any interest in city life. She'd been terrified of crowds since childhood. Margaret showed Luther the letter, yellowed with age, but carefully preserved. The handwriting looked similar to Ruth's, but somehow different. The letters more cramped, certain words misspelled that Ruth would never have gotten wrong. Margaret had written to the Cincinnati address provided. Her letters came back marked, addressee unknown. She'd contacted the Graysons twice, asking about her sister's whereabouts. Both times, Thomas's father had responded curtly that Ruth had left of her own accord, and they knew nothing more. In Letcher County, Luther found Harold Keene, whose younger brother Vincent had taken a job with the Graysons in 1937 for harvest season. Vincent was 22, saving money to marry his sweetheart in Pike County. He'd promised to return by October. When November came with no word, Harold had ridden to the Grayson property himself. Thomas's father, Cyrus, met him at the property line with a shotgun, not raised in threat, but present. Cyrus explained that Vincent had decided to move on, heading west for better opportunities. He'd been paid his wages and had left 3 weeks prior. Harold asked why Vincent hadn't written or stopped home first. Cyrus shrugged, said young men got wanderlust, and suggested Harold stop asking questions that weren't his business. The shotgun never moved, but its presence delivered a clear message. The pattern repeated across 5 more families. A niece who went to help with spring planting in 1941. A cousin's husband seeking temporary work in 1929. A traveling salesman who'd stopped at the property in 1935 and whose sample case later turned up abandoned on a roadside 20 miles away. Each disappearance came with a thin explanation, a sense of wrongness that families couldn't articulate but deeply felt, and a wall of silence from the Graysons that discouraged further inquiry. What emerged from Luther's investigation wasn't evidence exactly, but a mosaic of absence. People drawn to that isolated hollow by family obligation, economic necessity, or simple circumstance, vanishing into silence. The Grayson property had become a kind of gravitational void, pulling people in and offering only hollow explanations for why they never emerged. Luther compiled his notes across 6 weeks of interviews. 8 names from official records, now expanded to 13 through family testimonies. 13 people across 18 years, all connected to that homestead. All gone without credible trace. The mathematical probability of so many people independently choosing to sever all family contact after visiting the same location defied reasonable explanation. He returned to Pikeville with his findings and went directly to Sheriff Raymond Vance. The sheriff listened, read through Luther's careful documentation, and stared out his office window at the distant mountains. After a long silence, he reached for his telephone. What Luther had uncovered might not constitute legal proof, but it was enough to justify a welfare check. They would visit the Grayson property together, officially and with authority. And they would look behind that barn. Sheriff Vance and Deputy Bingham arrived at the Grayson homestead on March 27, 1947, accompanied by 2 additional deputies and the county coroner, Dr. William Hastings. The approach was deliberate and official, their vehicles navigating the treacherous mountain road in a procession that announced their purpose. Thomas Grayson met them on the porch, his wife Sarah visible through the window holding their infant daughter. Vance explained they were conducting routine welfare checks on isolated properties and wished to inspect the premises. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Kentucky law provided limited protection against such searches when officials had reasonable cause, and the sheriff's presence made refusal inadvisable. The men moved through the house methodically, noting the boarded windows. The stains Vera had mentioned, and a peculiar musty odor that seemed to emanate from the cellar. Luther examined the cellar door. A heavy padlock secured it, unusual for a simple storage space. When asked for the key, Thomas hesitated before producing it from his pocket. The cellar revealed typical provisions: jars of preserved vegetables, salted meat, but also a smaller door set into the far wall, partially concealed behind stacked crates. This door had no exterior lock, only a heavy bolt that fastened from the outside. Behind it, they found a windowless room approximately 8 feet square. The earthen floor was packed hard from use. Iron rings had been bolted into the timber supports at intervals. The smell here was worse, a combination of human waste, fear, and something older that had soaked into the very walls. Dr. Hastings emerged from the space looking shaken, confirming what they all suspected. This room had held people, likely for extended periods. Sheriff Vance placed Thomas under immediate detention and ordered a thorough search of the property. What they discovered behind the barn transformed suspicion into horrific certainty. 26 river stones, exactly as Vera had described, marking depressions in the earth that formed an unmistakable pattern. The sheriff ordered excavation to begin immediately. The first grave yielded human remains wrapped in deteriorated canvas. Dr. Hastings, whose experience consisted mainly of farm accidents and natural deaths, found himself examining evidence of violence. The skull showed clear trauma. Fabric remnants suggested clothing from at least a decade prior. By nightfall, 3 graves had been opened, each containing human remains in various states of decomposition. Word spread through the mountain communities with devastating speed. By the following morning, families who'd lost contact with relatives began arriving at the property, hoping for answers, but dreading confirmation. The excavation continued for 5 days, each grave revealing another victim. The oldest burials, based on decomposition and soil analysis, dated back at least 20 years. The most recent appeared to be from within the past 2 years. Personal effects recovered from the graves provided the first concrete identifications. A wedding ring engraved with initials that matched Ruth Stillwell's. A pocket watch belonging to Vincent Keene, its mechanism frozen at 3:30. A woman's locket containing photographs of children who would now learn their mother had never abandoned them as they'd been told. Thomas Grayson remained silent in custody, exercising his right against self-incrimination. But silence couldn't protect him from the evidence literally being unearthed from his property. As the final count reached 26 confirmed burials, Sheriff Vance expanded the investigation. If Thomas had continued his father's work, then Cyrus Grayson, dead 5 years, had likely originated it. The question became how far back the horror extended, and whether anyone beyond Thomas bore responsibility. Sarah Grayson, holding her newborn daughter, was taken into protective custody. Her testimony would prove crucial, but for now she seemed locked in traumatized silence, unable or unwilling to speak about what she'd witnessed in that isolated hollow where 26 people had been buried like unwanted secrets in the frozen Appalachian earth. The identification process consumed weeks as forensic specialists from Lexington worked alongside Dr. Hastings to match remains with missing persons reports. Dental records, when available, provided the most reliable confirmations. Clothing fragments, jewelry, and personal items filled in gaps where formal records failed. By late April, investigators had identified 19 of the 26 victims. Ruth Stillwell, the woman who'd gone to care for an ailing grandfather in 1932, was confirmed through her wedding ring and dental structure. She'd been 34. Vincent Keene, identified by his pocket watch and a distinctive bone fracture he'd sustained as a child, had been 22. The salesman from 1935 was Edmund Talbot, 41, whose sample case had been found abandoned. His company had filed a missing persons report that had gone nowhere. 3 victims were children, the youngest estimated at 14 years old. This discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Children suggested family members, not transient workers or distant relatives. Records revealed that Thomas's younger sister, Anna, had supposedly moved to Virginia in 1939 at age 16. His cousin's daughter, Lily, had allegedly gone to live with an aunt in Tennessee in 1941 at 15. Both girls were now confirmed among the dead. The geographic scope expanded investigators' understanding. Victims had come from 5 different states. A traveling preacher from West Virginia who'd been making rounds through isolated communities in 1938. A young couple from Memphis, Tennessee, newlyweds seeking work, who'd answered an advertisement for harvest help in 1943. A widow from Ohio who'd corresponded with Cyrus Grayson about purchasing preserves and had traveled to the property in 1936 to conduct business in person. Luther Bingham reconstructed how the Graysons had maintained their supply of victims. The homestead's isolation worked in their favor, but they'd also actively cultivated connections. Cyrus had placed advertisements in regional newspapers seeking seasonal workers. He'd maintained correspondence with distant family members, extending invitations for visits or assistance. Thomas's mother, who died in 1934, had belonged to a quilting circle that connected women across 3 counties, providing social cover and potential contacts. The property itself had served multiple functions in this machinery of death. The locked room in the cellar had held victims for days, sometimes weeks. Forensic evidence suggested forced labor, people compelled to work the property under threat or restraint before their eventual murder. The Graysons had essentially operated a system of captivity and exploitation hidden behind the facade of an isolated but unremarkable mountain family. 7 victims remained unidentified despite exhaustive efforts. Their remains suggested ages ranging from late teens to 60s, but without dental records or distinctive personal effects, their names stayed lost to history. These anonymous dead haunted the investigation, representing the most complete erasure the Graysons had achieved. People so thoroughly vanished that even death couldn't restore their identities. The Kentucky State Police established a formal task force by May, recognizing that the case's scope exceeded local resources. Regional newspapers published photographs of recovered jewelry and clothing items, desperate attempts to spark recognition from families who might not have filed official reports. In the 1920s and 30s especially, poor rural families often lacked the resources or knowledge to navigate official missing persons channels. Their relatives had simply disappeared, and they'd grieved privately, never imagining the systematic horror that had claimed them. As spring turned to early summer, investigators began excavating areas beyond the marked graves. Ground-penetrating technology didn't exist in rural Kentucky in 1947, so they relied on soil disturbances, vegetation patterns, and property surveys. They found 3 additional burial sites in a wooded area beyond the barn, bringing the potential total to 29. The nightmare, it seemed, ran even deeper than those 26 river stones had suggested. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching the main house in early June, investigators discovered a metal strongbox hidden beneath floorboards in what had been Cyrus Grayson's bedroom. Inside lay a collection of documents that would provide the most chilling evidence yet. Journals spanning 23 years, written in Cyrus's meticulous hand. The earliest entries dated to 1924, 3 years before the first confirmed victim. Cyrus wrote about his father's teachings, lessons about protecting the family bloodline from corruption and weakness. He described the homestead as sacred ground that needed defending from outsiders who would dilute their heritage or exploit their isolation. The ideology was twisted, a paranoid philosophy that cast anyone outside the immediate family as potential threats to be neutralized. By 1927, the entries shifted from abstract philosophy to concrete action. Cyrus documented the arrival of a hired hand named Joseph Brennan, age 26, who'd come for tobacco harvesting. The journal entry noted Brennan's loose morals and disrespectful attitude. 2 weeks later, Cyrus recorded Brennan's death with clinical detachment, describing the method, burial location, and estimated depth of the grave. No remorse, no moral struggle, just documentation, like a farmer recording livestock inventory. The journals revealed a systematic approach. Cyrus categorized his victims by perceived threat level. Family members who questioned his authority or showed signs of leaving received the harshest treatment. Outsiders who arrived seeking work were evaluated for useful labor before their disposal. Women were sometimes kept longer, forced into household servitude. The duration of captivity varied from days to months, depending on the victim's usefulness and the perceived risk of discovery. Thomas appeared in the journals starting in 1938, when he turned 18. Cyrus wrote about initiating his son into the family's necessary work, teaching him the same lessons about purity and protection. The entries suggested Thomas initially resisted, but gradually accepted his father's worldview. By 1942, Thomas was making his own decisions about who posed threats and required elimination. One entry from 1943 detailed the murder of the Tennessee newlyweds with disturbing precision. Cyrus described how they'd answered an advertisement for harvest work, arrived with hope and energy, and were separated within days. The husband was worked until exhaustion, then killed when he grew too weak for labor. The wife was held longer, forced to cook and clean, before meeting the same fate. Cyrus noted their burial locations with coordinates relative to property landmarks. The journals also explained gaps in victim identification. Cyrus occasionally burned personal effects or buried them separately from bodies, deliberately destroying evidence that might enable future identification. He viewed this as additional protection, ensuring certain victims vanished so completely that even their deaths would remain anonymous. Those 7 unidentified remains represented his most successful erasures. Sarah Grayson's involvement emerged through later entries written by Thomas after his father's death in 1942. Thomas mentioned Sarah's awareness and occasional participation in restraining victims or disposing of evidence. The entries suggested she'd been coerced initially, but had grown complicit over time, trapped by fear, isolation, and gradual normalization of horror. The journals provided prosecutors with devastating evidence, but also raised disturbing questions. How many additional victims existed before 1927? Cyrus's father had allegedly taught him these methods, suggesting the pattern might extend back to the 1880s, when the family first settled the property. The journals mentioned father's work and continuing the tradition, implying this wasn't Cyrus's innovation, but inherited practice spanning generations. The true scope might never be known, buried too deep in time and earth to ever recover. The investigation's expanded scope brought families from across the region to Pike County throughout the summer of 1947. The courthouse became an informal gathering place where relatives compared photographs, shared memories of lost loved ones, and found grim solidarity in their collective grief. Margaret Stillwell met Harold Keene, discovering their siblings had likely been held captive simultaneously in 1937, before their murders. Newspaper coverage transformed the case into national news. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a front-page story in July with the headline, "Mountain Horror: Decades of Murder in Kentucky Hollow." The Cincinnati Enquirer published victim profiles, humanizing the dead beyond mere statistics. Radio broadcasts carried updates as investigators continued excavating the property and surrounding woodland. The Grayson case became shorthand for a particular kind of rural American nightmare: isolation turned predatory. Law enforcement agencies across Appalachia began reviewing their own cold cases. In West Virginia, authorities reopened investigations into 3 missing persons who'd last been seen traveling through eastern Kentucky. Tennessee officials identified 2 unsolved disappearances with potential Grayson connections. The ripple effect revealed how porous law enforcement had been across state lines in earlier decades, how easily people could vanish in the gaps between jurisdictions. The State Police Task Force compiled a comprehensive timeline by August. They confirmed 29 victims through physical evidence, with strong circumstantial cases for 6 additional disappearances that lacked conclusive proof. The earliest confirmed murder dated to 1927, but Cyrus's journals suggested his father's involvement in similar crimes as far back as the 1890s. If true, the Grayson family's systematic violence had persisted for at least 50 years across 3 generations. Geographic analysis revealed the calculated nature of victim selection. Most came from beyond Pike County, reducing local scrutiny. The Graysons had exploited regional economic desperation during the Depression, when people traveled long distances for any promise of work. They'd manipulated family obligations, convincing relatives that visits were necessary while knowing those visitors would never leave. They'd preyed on traveling salesmen, preachers, and itinerant workers whose movements made their disappearances less immediately suspicious. The case also exposed systemic failures in missing persons investigations. During the 1920s and 30s especially, rural law enforcement operated with minimal resources and training. When poor families reported relatives missing, investigations rarely extended beyond cursory inquiries. Class prejudice played a role as well. Authorities often assumed that impoverished people simply moved on, seeking opportunities elsewhere, rather than considering foul play. Dr. Hastings completed his forensic analysis by September, determining causes of death for most victims. Blunt force trauma predominated, suggesting beatings or strikes with tools. Several victims showed signs of prolonged malnutrition and physical abuse consistent with forced labor and captivity. 3 had been shot, executions rather than murders committed in rage. The clinical nature of the violence reinforced what the journals revealed. This was systematic killing executed with cold purpose rather than passion. Sarah Grayson finally broke her silence in late September after months of protective custody. Her attorney negotiated testimony in exchange for consideration during sentencing. What she revealed added texture to the documentary evidence. She described daily life on the property, the locked room where victims were held, Thomas's methodical approach to selecting and disposing of people he deemed threatening. Her account confirmed that she'd been terrorized into compliance, but had eventually participated in restraining victims and destroying evidence. The prosecution now possessed overwhelming evidence for trial. 29 bodies, detailed journals documenting murders, forensic evidence of systematic violence, and eyewitness testimony from someone inside the household. Thomas Grayson's defense attorney faced an impossible task, and the entire region waited to see justice delivered for crimes that had festered in mountain isolation for half a century. The trial began on October 6, 1947, in the Pike County Courthouse, a building never designed to accommodate the national attention now focused upon it. Judge Harold Pritchard presided, a veteran of 20 years on the bench who understood the weight of what would unfold. Thomas Grayson sat beside his attorney, Raymond Hicks, a competent defender facing a case no legal strategy could salvage. Sarah Grayson would be tried separately after her testimony concluded. Prosecutor James Caldwell opened with devastating simplicity. He placed 29 photographs on the evidence table, each showing recovered remains. He read names of identified victims, pausing after each to let the reality settle. For the unidentified, he simply stated, "Unknown woman, approximately 30 years old," or "Unknown man, late 50s. The courtroom held over 200 people, including families of the dead, journalists from a dozen newspapers, and curious observers who'd traveled from neighboring states. The prosecution's case methodically built through 2 weeks of testimony. Dr. Hastings described forensic findings, explaining trauma patterns and estimated times of death. Luther Bingham walked the jury through his investigation, the pattern of disappearances, and the moment they discovered those river stones behind the barn. Sheriff Vance testified about the locked room, the iron rings, the evidence of prolonged captivity. Each witness added another layer to an undeniable narrative of systematic murder. Cyrus's journals provided the most damning evidence. Caldwell read selected entries aloud, his voice steady as he recounted clinical descriptions of killings. The jury heard about Joseph Brennan in 1927, about the Tennessee newlyweds in 1943, about Thomas's sister Anna, whose own brother had participated in her murder in 1939. The courtroom remained silent, except for occasional sobbing from victim families. Even hardened journalists struggled to maintain professional detachment. Sarah Grayson's testimony occupied 3 full days. She described meeting Thomas in 1941, marrying him despite her family's concerns about his isolation and odd demeanor. Within months of moving to the homestead, she'd discovered the truth. Thomas had shown her the cellar room, explained his father's teachings about protecting the bloodline, and made clear that leaving meant death. She'd witnessed 4 murders during her 6 years there, been forced to help dispose of evidence, and lived in constant terror that she'd be next. The defense attempted to portray Thomas as a victim of his father's indoctrination, a man raised in such twisted ideology that he couldn't distinguish right from wrong. Hicks called a psychiatrist from Louisville who testified about generational trauma and environmental conditioning. But cross-examination revealed Thomas's active participation in planning murders, his continuation of the practice after Cyrus's death, and his elaborate efforts to conceal evidence. The insanity defense crumbled under the weight of premeditation and systematic execution. Sarah's defense proved more complex. Her attorney, Marcus Fenway, argued coercion and duress, painting her as another victim trapped by Thomas's violence and the property's isolation. Prosecutors countered with evidence of her active participation. Testimony suggesting she'd helped restrain victims, her role in forging letters to families, her failure to seek help during rare trips to town for supplies. After 6 weeks, both cases went to separate juries. Thomas's verdict came first. Guilty on 29 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in cathartic release, families weeping, journalists rushing to telephones. Sarah's jury deliberated longer, struggling with the complexity of victimhood versus complicity. They returned guilty verdicts on accessory to murder for 12 counts and complicity in 4 deaths, where evidence showed direct participation. Sentencing would determine whether Thomas faced execution or life imprisonment, whether Sarah received any mercy for her coerced involvement. Judge Pritchard scheduled the hearing for November 15th, giving both sides time to prepare arguments about appropriate punishment for crimes that had shocked the nation. The sentencing hearing on November 15th drew even larger crowds than the trial itself. Families of the victims packed the courthouse, many having waited months for this moment. Margaret Stillwell held a photograph of her sister Ruth, refusing to let the woman be reduced to a name on a court document. Harold Keene sat beside her, carrying Vincent's pocket watch, its hands still frozen at 3:30. Prosecutor Caldwell argued for the death penalty with controlled intensity. He reminded the court of 29 lives systematically extinguished, of children murdered by their own family, of people who'd come seeking honest work or offering help and found only captivity and death. He described the locked cellar room, the years of terror, the calculated deception that allowed the murders to continue across decades. This wasn't crime committed in passion or desperation, but methodical elimination of human beings deemed inconvenient or threatening to a twisted ideology. Defense attorney Hicks made his final argument for life imprisonment, citing Thomas's indoctrination from childhood and the absence of any life experience outside his father's poisonous teachings. He argued that executing Thomas wouldn't restore the dead or prevent similar crimes, that life in prison offered appropriate punishment without making the state complicit in taking another life. His argument was professional and thorough, but even he seemed to recognize its futility against the magnitude of evidence. Judge Pritchard deliberated for 2 hours before returning to the bench. The courtroom fell silent as he addressed Thomas directly. He spoke about the sanctity of human life, the betrayal of trust when people seeking help found murder instead, and the particular evil of violence hidden behind the facade of family and isolation. His voice remained steady as he pronounced sentence: death by electrocution for each of the 29 murder convictions, to be carried out at the Kentucky State Penitentiary. The sentences would run concurrently, but the symbolic weight of 29 death penalties underscored the scope of horror. Sarah's sentencing followed immediately. Fenway made an impassioned plea for leniency, emphasizing her status as a victim who'd been terrorized into compliance. He noted she'd ultimately testified against Thomas, providing crucial evidence that secured convictions. Caldwell countered that complicity in murder, regardless of motivation, demanded significant punishment, that fear didn't absolve her of responsibility for the deaths she'd helped facilitate. Judge Pritchard sentenced Sarah to life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 20 years. He acknowledged the complexity of her situation, but stated that her participation in concealing murders and destroying evidence represented criminal conduct that couldn't be excused entirely by duress. She would serve her sentence at the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women, separated from her infant daughter, who'd been placed with Sarah's sister in Virginia. The courtroom cleared slowly, families lingering as if reluctant to leave this space where justice had finally manifested. Outside, journalists interviewed relatives, capturing their relief mixed with enduring grief. Margaret Stillwell told reporters that no sentence could return Ruth, but knowing the truth after 15 years of wondering brought its own painful peace. Beyond the immediate case, the reverberations extended into policy and practice. The Kentucky State Police established new protocols for investigating missing persons in rural areas, recognizing how isolation had enabled decades of murder. Other Appalachian states implemented similar reforms, training officers to look beyond surface explanations when people vanished from remote communities. Social workers began regular welfare checks on isolated homesteads, though the practice faced resistance from families who valued their independence and privacy. The Grayson property became a subject of debate. Some argued for preservation as a memorial to the victims. Others insisted it should be destroyed completely to prevent morbid tourism. In January 1949, the county authorized demolition. The buildings were razed, the cellar filled with concrete, and the land left to return to wilderness. Only the burial area remained marked, 29 simple stones, replacing the original river rocks, each now bearing a name, or the inscription, known only to God. Thomas Grayson was executed on June 3, 1949, at the Kentucky State Penitentiary. He never spoke publicly about his crimes beyond a brief statement, claiming he'd done what was necessary to protect his family's legacy. 27 people witnessed the execution, including Sheriff Vance, Deputy Bingham, and 3 family members of victims who'd requested to attend. His death closed one chapter, but left questions that would haunt researchers for generations. In the decades following the trial, historians and criminologists returned repeatedly to the Grayson case, seeking to understand how such systematic horror had persisted, undetected for so long. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, an anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, conducted extensive research in the 1960s, interviewing neighbors and distant relatives who'd known the family. Her findings revealed a community that had sensed something wrong, but lacked language or framework to articulate their suspicions. The Graysons had been regarded as odd, reclusive, perhaps unnaturally protective of their isolation, but nothing that demanded intervention. The case fundamentally altered how law enforcement approached missing persons in isolated communities. By the 1950s, Appalachian states had implemented mandatory follow-up procedures for disappearances in rural areas, requiring officers to conduct property searches and interview multiple witnesses rather than accepting family explanations at face value. These reforms came too late for the Grayson victims, but potentially prevented similar crimes from taking root elsewhere. Archived documents examined in the 1970s suggested the pattern might indeed extend back to the 1880s, as Cyrus's journals had implied. Property records showed the original Grayson patriarch, Ezekiel, had acquired several adjacent parcels under suspicious circumstances, claiming previous owners had abandoned them or sold out suddenly. Local newspaper accounts from the 1890s mentioned occasional disappearances of travelers in that region, though without explicit connection to the Grayson property. Definitive proof remained elusive, but circumstantial evidence painted a disturbing possibility of multi-generational violence spanning 70 years. The infant born during Vera Hutchins' visit, the child whose birth had ultimately exposed the murders, grew up far from Kentucky's mountains. Adopted by Sarah's sister and given a new name, she lived a quiet life in Virginia, never returning to the Hollow, where her father had committed atrocities. Journalists occasionally attempted to contact her, seeking perspective on her unusual legacy, but she consistently declined interviews. Her silence seemed less about shame than a determination not to let her father's crimes define her existence. Sarah Grayson died in prison in 1973 at age 56, having served 26 years. She'd been denied parole 3 times, the board determining her complicity outweighed her victimhood. In her final years, she'd taught literacy classes to other inmates, a small redemption in a life marked by terrible choices and circumstantial tragedy. Her daughter never visited, a decision that prison counselors understood as necessary self-preservation. The burial site where 29 victims finally received proper rest became an unofficial memorial, maintained by local historical societies and occasionally visited by descendants of the dead. In 1997, on the 50th anniversary of the investigation, a formal marker was installed bearing all 29 names with the inscription, "Gone but not forgotten. Truth revealed 1947." The Grayson case remains studied in criminal justice programs as an example of how geographic and social isolation can enable systematic violence when combined with law enforcement limitations and community blind spots. It illustrates the importance of victim advocacy, thorough investigation of missing persons regardless of economic status, and the danger of dismissing suspicions about isolated families as merely cultural difference or legitimate desire for privacy. Vera Hutchins, whose courage in reporting what she'd witnessed initiated the entire investigation, continued nursing until her retirement in 1972. She rarely spoke publicly about the case, but in a 1985 interview shortly before her death, she reflected that sometimes evil persists simply because good people lack the knowledge or courage to confront it. Her decision to trust her instincts and seek help had given 29 victims their names back, and their families a truth that, however painful, was better than endless wondering. So if this case teaches us anything, it's that isolation can hide the darkest secrets, but truth has a way of surfacing when people refuse to look away. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about the missing and forgotten, show your support by clicking that like button and subscribing to the channel. We're committed to bringing these buried stories to light, honoring victims who deserve to be remembered. Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime told with respect and depth. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop seeking the truth.